Exploration of the Pico de Orizaba Obsidian Mines. Episode 2, Working on a Volcanic Slope at 13,800 feet. As mentioned in Episode 1, oral tradition recorded Citlatépetl erupted when Quetzalcoatl was buried on the summit of the volcano. Once the god's body was placed at the center of the crater, lava poured forth and the flames consumed the mortal body of Quetzalcoatl. But his soul took the form of a flying quetzal until, seen from below, it looked like a brilliant star. Photographed, written, and podcast video produced. Directed and programmed by Jack Lamb. Dr. Terry Stocker and Jack Lamb. Photograph taken in 1981 as we ascended the volcano, Pico de Orizaba, to explore, photograph and survey the lost Aztec mines. Terry Stocker and Jack Lamb had numerous tasks to accomplish during the 8 days before Cerro Tinclay would return. Before attempting any underground exploration, we decided to survey all of the taluses first, while at the same time looking for accessible obsidian mine entrances. From what we could see as we walked to the eastern edge of the valley, approximately a dozen taluses spotted a 400-yard stretch of the south-facing ridge. Fully fitted out with the equipment we would need for the day, we carefully descended to what we labeled talus number 1 at the far eastern end of the ridge. Not far from where the plateau precipitously ended above the jungles of Veracruz, nearly 3 miles below our position, hidden beneath an impenetrable cloud cover. I don't understand why all this obsidian is simply lying here on a remote mountainside, Jack admitted. These taluses were made by the Aztec miners when they burrowed into the obsidian flow coring this ridge, Stocker answered. Tunneling into the obsidian produces waste material which accumulates downslope of the mines, thus, initially creating the taluses. Then as artisans worked the obsidian into polyhedral cores and blades for transport, the debitage added to the accretion. And over the millennia, the taluses grew larger. So then there should be a mine above each talus? Jack questioned. Theoretically, yes. Stocker qualified. But there's no telling how many centuries have passed since anyone last mined obsidian here. Therefore, the mines might be hidden beneath fallen rock, or more likely, the yearly organic debris amassed during the intervening centuries. The exposed area of talus number 1 seemed relatively small, at least when compared against the much larger taluses further west. Removing the 100-foot measuring tape from his pack, Jack handed Stocker the leading end. Hold the end of the tape, Jack said before descending the talus. Now pull it tight, he called when reaching the bottom extent of the tailings, reeling in the excess tape to measure the vertical length of the expanse of the obsidian talus. 90 feet. Jack shouted out loudly so Stocker could write the measurement in the notebook. Okay, now move about half a dozen paces to the west, so we can measure the width of the talus, Jack directed as he climbed up the steep slope. Then, he stretched the tape to the eastern edge of the talus and took another measurement. 50 feet. He shouted across the talus, after which Stocker wrote the measurement in the notebook. Next to its dimensions, make a rough sketch of the shape of each talus, Jack explained on rejoining Stocker. Then in a day or two we can climb the slope on the other side of the valley, and look back and map the relative positions of each talus by sight. Measure each talus at the longest point top to bottom, and the width at the widest point east to west. Right. I suppose exactness isn't vital because we're only measuring the visible tailings, and not what's buried under all the debris around the perimeter, Stocker agreed. In any event, it's likely the size and shape of each talus change every few years due to erosion and climatic change. Stocker waited near a boulder while Jack hunted above the talus for any sign of a mine entrance. But other than a low wall of stone built on a flat ledge cut into the slope, the latter failed to find an entrance. There are some rocks laid out in a rectangle to the northeast of the tailings, but no mine entrance, Jack called to him. That's what remains of a house foundation, Stocker called back as he moved over to inspect the stones and mark their position on his sketch. Cobain and I found the remnants of several houses, clearly used by the miners, Stocker added. Can you see the terrace far down the slope below us? I believe the Aztec miners, or their women, farmed there. Peering down the slope below the taluses, Jack noted a leveled strip of land which he assumed was the farming terrace. Extending 300 yards east to west along the ridge, the terrace averaged 60 yards wide. The next talus, labeled as talus number 2, was much larger than the first, measuring 150 feet long by 80 feet wide. On once again searching the slope above the talus, Stalker identified 2 more house foundations, but still he found no mine entrance. I remember a mine being here. So, I'll look around a bit longer, Stalker remarked before continuing his search. He methodically examined the hillside, even going to the trouble of parting the tall stands of dry grass growing in profusion on the steeply canted slope. Fortuitously, after a brief search his efforts proved fruitful. I finally found an entrance, Stalker announced in satisfaction, while bending over the diminutive diameter of the dark black hole in the exposed rock outcropping, all but hidden in the tall grass. With flashlight in hand, Jack lowered himself feet first into the opening until his boots touched solid earth. And after a brief near-level descent, the passageway canted down a sharper slope, so he turned around and exited the shaft. We'll need to rig a rope, and probably rappel into this mine shaft, he advised after returning to the surface. Let's call this the talus number 2 mine, Stalker specified as he marked its location on the map. Adjacent to the west and flowing into talus number 2 50 feet downslope, was a much larger talus we labeled talus number 3, measuring approximately 200 feet long by 90 feet wide. Examining the hillside upslope, we discovered what might have once been a mine entrance, now blocked by a huge boulder fallen long ago from the rocky cliff near the top of the ridge. Using a folding shovel we tried to excavate under the blockage, but the blade only met impenetrable rock wherever we tried to dig. So, talus number 3 mine might be sealed, Stalker stated abstractly, as he once more wrote our findings in the notebook. I wonder if anyone was inside when the boulder fell, Jack mused, trying to imagine the resulting repercussions of such an event. Wouldn't it be incredible if we found Aztec remains buried inside one of these mine shafts? Stalker professed enthusiastically. We moved to the next talus, now designated as talus number 4, measuring 80 feet long by 60 feet wide. And after a lengthy search in the rock outcroppings dotting the slope above the obsidian talus, we inexplicably once more failed to find a mine entrance. Then after searching above the adjacent talus to the northwest, labeled talus number 5 measuring 100 feet by 80 feet, we elected to markedly widen our search. And providentially, by moving ever higher up the ridge, we eventually located a mine entrance approximately 80 feet upslope and low to the ground, hidden behind a snarl of vines. A profusion of decortication flakes, percussion macroflakes and macroblades littered the surface of the talus, with discarded polyhedral cores deemed unsuitable by Aztec artisans scattered in abundance. At the top of the talus, we used the shovel to clear away debris, and found many broken pressure flakes and blades settled between the obsidian debitage. This Pico de Orizaba obsidian is colored a translucent gray with darker gray striations, Jack observed after picking up an obsidian flake and holding it up to the sun to check its color and translucency. As far as I'd been able to discover on previous visits to the mines, all the obsidian tailing here share those qualities, Stalker confirmed. Next, moving 120 feet downslope to the southwest, we explored the much larger talus number 6, stretching 200 feet long by 250 feet wide at the widest point. The obsidian fragments, debitage and broken artifacts here were at least 10 feet deep at the center of the enormous tailings. After a brief rest, we climbed upslope to the northwest to examine talus number 7, which lay below our camp. Despite its small size, barely 50 feet long by 35 feet wide, we discovered 2 house foundations beside a mine entrance upslope of the talus. Again, Jack dropped into the shaft to reconnoiter. 6 feet inside, the passage dropped vertically, but the descent would be easy with the proper lights and gear. The final group of 3 taluses lay 350 feet further west. The easternmost talus number 8 and the bordering talus number 9 each measured 300 feet long by 70 feet wide at the very top, before flowing together downslope to combine into a single expanse of obsidian. Inexplicably, given the size of debitage blanketing the slope, we could not locate a mine entrance above either talus. That said, we did find the remains of house walls. Just beyond this huge area of obsidian, lay talus number 10 to the far west, measuring 170 feet long by 100 feet wide. While we found another house foundation above this talus, inexplicably, we once more failed to find a mine entrance. These last 3 taluses combined to form the single largest expanse of tailings on the ridge. It was inexplicably baffling how 3 obsidian mines producing such a vast quantity of volcanic glass could remain hidden from us. The tailings here are immense. Therefore, the mines producing all this obsidian must be enormous. Jack insisted in exasperation. It just makes no sense. Why can't we find mines associated with these taluses? I suppose it's possible the Aztec miners might have sealed these mines on purpose. Stalker mused aloud. Then we're screwed. Jack lamented disheartened. At least we found 3 mines. Stalker replied sensibly. The tight entrance into each mine would force us to crawl on our stomachs to enter. However, this would have made removing the mined volcanic glass difficult. How did miners remove large quantities of obsidian from such small entrances? It seemed unlikely they could extract enough to account for the vast expanse of debitage strewn on the slope. That night we sat in silence for a long time, each of us wrapped in thought while staring into the fire's flames. Absently, Jack wondered how many thousands of generations of humanity had spent their evenings just so, watching burning coals dance in the heat of flickering flames. But for the quirks of chance, time and space, placing us in our modern world where we awaited the dawn to begin our exploration of the obsidian mines, we might have been Aztec miners hunched here under the same overhang waiting for the dawn to return to the mine tunnels beneath us, to labor until another nightfall allowed us to quit and return to the fire to rest. Conceivably all past and future temporalities continuously burn synchronously, with the life of each conscious entity sharing an historical universal timeline of existential reality, modulating concurrently at diverse frequencies within a multitude of illusory three-dimensional spatialities wherein consciousness resides. Perhaps eternally persisting extant as oscillating wavelengths imperceptible to our time-tuned sensibilities. If so, then everyone who ever sat or would sit around a fire against this very same cliff, although unseen, concurrently existed and persisted here in an Ouroborosian eternality of the now, unconsciously communing without knowing it, each of us focused on our fire's dancing blaze. Contemplatively consumed and broodingly obsessed by these bizarre metaphysical musings provoked by the mesmerizing flickering flames, Jack hardly noticed when his companions crawled into their tents to sleep. Nocturnal musings on hexagrams and gods. Mural of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl. Jack should have felt exhausted after nearly a sleepless night and a day of continual exertion at high altitude, but he was restless and more in need of solitude and contemplation than sleep. But the fact there was so much stark disruption and suffering among the members of their expedition implied radical perturbations in the flow of their reality too unambiguous to ignore. Consequently, he decided to consult the oracle of the I Ching to discern a path that would lead them back to normalcy. Ever since reading the book, The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse and discovering the credibility of the Wilhelm translation of the Book of Changes or I Ching, Jack had been an ardent student of this ancient 4,000-year-old system of divination. Counting stocks gathered on the Continental Divide in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, while reflecting on the temporal span of our expedition, he cast an oracle foretelling metaphorically what we could expect to occur on our expedition. The point of counting yarrow stalks is to arrive at a 6-line hexagram comprised of 2 3-line trigrams. Oddly, the reiteration of methodically counting persistently put me in a meditative state conducive to prophetic divination. The 8 trigrams reflect the forces at work within the world. Any one of 64 possible permutations, called hexagrams, can result from the combination of any upper and lower trigram, which Wilhelm charts in tablature in his translation to determine each detailed reading. The firelight was bright enough to divide and count the stalks, and Jack had a flashlight in his pocket to illuminate the book as he read the passages that in turn would enlighten him. It was peaceful sitting cross-legged beside the fire systematically counting the yarrow, and he lost himself in serene meditation until both trigrams were resolved. Initially setting one yarrow stalk aside from the set of 50, he split the remaining 49 into two random groups. Temporarily laying aside the right-hand cluster, save for one stalk placed between his left-hand ring and middle fingers, he removed stalks in sets of 4 from the group in his left hand, until 4 or fewer remained. Then moving those between his index and middle fingers, he took the right-hand cluster of stalks he earlier laid aside, and once more removed stalks in sets of 4 until 4 or fewer remained. After 3 counts for each line, the resulting sum equated to 2 of 4 Boolean states, broken or unbroken and moving or unmoving. Performing this count 3 times results in a 3-line lower trigram, and repeating the progression a second time defines the upper trigram. The numerical result derived when casting the stalk 6 times equated to one of 64 hexagrams from the combination of 8 upper and 8 lower trigrams. And in this casting, he arrived at the hexagram thunder, Chen, over the lower trigram earth, Kuan. Finally, in conclusion, looking up the combined trigrams in Wilhelm's translation of the Book of Changes, Jack learned he cast the hexagram enthusiasm. The hexagram enthusiasm. The judgment. Enthusiasm. It furthers one to install helpers and to set armies marching. The image. Thunder comes resounding out of the earth, the image of enthusiasm, thus the ancient kings made music in order to honor merit, and offered it with splendor to the supreme deity, inviting their ancestors to be present. So many significant synchronicities occurred to Jack based on the reading of the hexagram, he felt as if he were in perfect alignment with the world. Thunder may come from the earth as earthquakes or lightning discharges, but so does obsidian. And ancient kings could be a reference to the long-dead Aztec rulers. The moon arcs behind the cone of Pico de Orizaba. Despite the freezing air and darkness, Jack decided to take an impromptu nighttime walk on the talus-covered slope. And with flashlight in hand, he moved down the ridge, diagonally descending eastward. Bathed in the brilliance of the full moon in the wispy atmosphere at high altitude, the moonlight was so bright that walking was easier than expected. So bright, in fact, he had no need of the flashlight. With the winter moon in the southern sky, its light struck the slope underfoot at a right angle of incidence, providing the brightest illumination imaginable until the bright orb of the lunar surface would inexorably move behind the towering summit of the 18,500-foot volcano, Citlatépetl. Nighttime notwithstanding, Jack inexplicably decided to descend to talus number 7 in order to search for obsidian artifacts in the debitage, until the moon finally eclipsed behind the peak, or sleepiness drove him to his tent. The volcanic glass comprising the dark talus literally sparkled in the moonlight like a million stars strewn beneath his feet, and he spent a half an hour examining the glittering assortment. Since most of the obsidian was debitage rejected by the Aztec craftsmen as imperfect or broken, it was not easy to find artifacts still intact to his less discerning eye. Jack had found a small collection of intact obsidian artifacts. Among them, a macro core and a polyhedral core, several percussion blades, and a mix of broken razors. In addition, he found 2 depleted fluted cores and 3 small bifaces rejected by the Aztec artisans. By the time Jack began to get sleepy, the cone of the volcano began to eclipse the moon as it arced across the sky, casting its shadow over the lower end of the talus and inexorably crawling up the slope towards him as the moon moved ever further behind the cratered summit. Passing the house foundation stones while climbing back to camp, he stopped briefly after noticing broken eroded pottery fragments made of reddish clay lying in the dirt. There were no whole pots in sight, but expecting none, Jack was content to find signs of Aztec habitation. But as he absently filtered dirt and debitage through his fingers looking for more shards, Citlatépetl's shadow overtook him to interpose the moonlight. Overwhelmed by fatigue, and feeling isolated and alone as he climbed up the slope, in a moment of weakness Jack pondered the Mesoamerican gods who seemed very real to him that night on the volcano. While he did not truly believe in the Mesoamerican gods, he nevertheless yearned for a manifestation of such a deity to substantiate the magic he felt that night. Like the mythical Greek gods, he assumed the Aztec gods obsessively must have meddled in the affairs of men. And in this nocturnal obscurity, Jack found himself imagining what it might be like to come face to face with a god forced into seclusion on these isolated upper reaches of Citlatépetl by an unavoidable dearth of believers in the age of Christianity. By nature, Jack believed his alignment would be accordant with the Lord of Light, Quetzalcoatl, associated with all creative processes such as light and life, learning and knowledge, and arts and crafts. But in view of his location in the striated gray of the obsidian night, and their plight and purpose for being on obsidian taluses excavated by Aztec obsidian miners from obsidian mines tunneling into a volcanic obsidian flow, Jack imagined he was more likely to meet the god of obsidian, Tezcatlipoca, known as the obsidian smoking mirror. Tezcatlipoca was the dark reflection of the Lord of Light. Associated with temptation and beauty, enmity and discord, divination and sorcery, and warfare and strife, Tezcatlipoca demanded human sacrifice and cannibalism from his disciples, and in addition supported slavery. Without cause, a shiver swept through his body and Jack unwillingly glanced behind him, as if expecting to catch a glimpse of the trickster himself. But alas, he saw nothing so paranormal. But as he dwelled on the evidential existentiality of the gods of old, he resolved to tread lightly on this volcano out of respect for these once powerful deities. Whether they ultimately proved real or mythical did not change the fact that every Mesoamerican population and culture believed strongly enough in their pantheon to not only worship them, but sacrifice captives in their names. Whether it is gods who create men, or men who create gods, there is a substantive interdependence between both groups hinting at a deeper truth as to whether men or gods can exist, one without the other. However, setting his opinions aside, Jack recognized the power this relationship had generated in every corner of the ancient and modern worlds to foment far-reaching change, while at the same time generating pain, suffering, and death throughout the history of mankind. Stalker had maintained that civilizations fought wars for slaves and tribute. But it seemed to Jack that, without actually knowing why, men ultimately fought wars for their gods. For men do not berserkly kill men en masse unless it is in the name of their god, which is true whether they believe in some ancient bygone deity in the Mesoamerican pantheon, or Christianity's one true God. The Spanish conquistadors proved this unequivocally when they exterminated nearly 80% of the New World pre-Columbian indigenes in the name of their Christian deity, Jesus of Nazareth. With these dark musings occupying his thoughts, Jack returned to camp and entered his tent to find sleep for what remained of the night. Look for the final YouTube podcast episode of Exploration of the Pico de Orizaba Obsidian Mines. Chapter 3, In a Crystalline Geotic Web of Obsidian.